Hi guys, welcome back. In this chapter, I'm gonna show you a very popular method to draw faces with realistic proportions called the Loomis method, because of the person who invented it. This method has a lot of limitations in my opinion, but it's pretty good to get your bearings as a beginner. As you progress in your practice, you'll probably discard it because it's quite rigid and you'll find proportions that work best for you and your style, along with developing an intuitive eye for drawing faces in proportion without resorting to step-by-step processes. However, as I was saying, when you start drawing, this method can be quite useful to understand the relation between the various elements in the face, where they stand in relation to each other. These are generic grids that, again, don't really reflect any real human face, but you can tweak the grid and make your own proportions to experiment with different physiognomies. Without further ado, let's get started with this step-by-step method. First, draw a rectangle, or use the shape-making tool in Photoshop to make a rectangle. This is the boundary of the grid you'll use to draw the face, therefore it will contain the shape of the face. If you make it larger, the person will have a larger face. If you make it long and thin, that will also reflect in the person's face. For the sake of standardization, let's make it about 1.5 times taller than the horizontal length. Second, draw a vertical line in the middle of the rectangle. This is the central axis of the face. Now draw two horizontal lines dividing the rectangle roughly in thirds. Now you have roughly 6 squares. The top two will serve to draw the forehead, the middle one will house the nose and eyes, while the lower ones will be used for the mouth and chin. In the midsection, but outside the grid, is also where we will place the ears. Now let's focus on the mid and lower sections and let's add to the grid, which I'm doing in purple. Trace 2 vertical lines in the middle of the squares, making 4 rectangles. Then divide these rectangles horizontally again with 2 lines each at 1/3 point. This will make each original square into 6 smaller rectangles. Starting from the middle line of each mid-square, I'm going to trace an arc, aiming for the middle external side of the top squares. This roughly outlines the temporal muscle that we saw in the previous video as a landmark. Then I'm gonna draw another arc, this time starting from the bottom left corner of the top square and going towards the middle top side. This is the upper boundary of the skull and basically of the face. You can do it on the other side too to have a rough idea of the full outline of the top of the head. Then, starting from the lower left corner of the top rectangle in the middle section, draw an arc aiming for the top of the middle line, which then will turn downwards when it reaches the other half of the face. This arc that I'm drawing in green highlights the brow line above the eyes, the protruding area above the orbital cavity. Now that we have that, draw 2 vertical lines, dividing in half the inner rectangles in the middle section. These lines define the boundaries of the nose, which I'm drawing now in dark green. The bottom of the nose will sit on the line delimiting the middle and bottom section, with the point of the nose defining a circle of various sizes according to the dimensions of the nose, whose center is exactly at the intersection of the mid and bottom section with the central axis. If you imagine building a triangle, having the lower corners set at the sides of the nose and proceeding upward towards the central axis, that dotted area is the convex space that is often in the shade when you draw a portrait. Now let's focus on the eyes. Draw a circle roughly on the intersection of the top third of the middle section and the first vertical line. This is going to be the iris of the eye. The iris corresponds to 1/3 of the full dimension of the eye, so using it as your measurement, mark down 2 lines to the sides of it as the other 2/3. Draw 2 arcs, one above the circle and the other one below, both ending where you have marked the third in blue. Please note that the top arc is going to be more curved than the bottom one. Of course, this isn't taking into account all the various types and shapes of eyes that there are in reality. This is a simplified guide. Now let's move to the bottom section and focus on the mouth. Take the first vertical line in the bottom section and highlight a length of it in between the first and middle third. Then, horizontally partition the first third in more thirds, while the middle third is divided in half. This is the guide for the top and bottom lip. The top lip is comprised in 1/3, while the bottom one occupies half of the middle section, with the chin occupying the lower half. Again, there are many different mouth shapes in the world that may not reflect these proportions, and this is just a guide. Now trace 2 vertical lines in the inner lower thirds of the bottom section. I'm drawing them in blue, and they delimit the chin, which will slightly stick out of the grid. Starting from the external end of the chin, trace a slightly curved line towards the top corner of the lower third of the middle section. This outlines the lower part of the cheekbones. Please note that the grid only accounts for the very front section of the head, so the cheekbone actually continues diagonally to the side of the face until it disappears, but we can't see it from the front. Go back to the same point down on the chin and trace another line aiming for the bottom side of the top third in the lower section. From there, turn upwards towards the same point where the cheekbone ends. This outlines the jaw. I'm shading this area because, of course, this isn't facing the viewer straight, but it's actually turning sideways around the head. So this whole area is actually a bit convex. Great! As you can see, this method is super easy to follow, and while it may not look like the best likeness of a human being, if you follow the steps and the grid to remind you of the correct process, you can then apply it to many different proportions and styles, customizing it for your needs. Let's see how it works from the side. Of course, the first step is still to draw a rectangle as the container for the grid. This time, the rectangle has to be a bit larger in width, because it needs to contain the sphere including the back of the head. Just like for the front, divide the rectangle in half and then thirds. This time you will not get squares, but horizontal rectangles. Section off an oval in the inner half of the central section. This is where the ear goes. Then roughly follow the same proportions you used for the eyes, nose, mouth, and chin from the front grid. Simply, they will all stick out on one side. Now focusing on the lower section, draw 2 horizontal lines in the left-hand rectangle to divide it in thirds. Then 1 central vertical line to divide it in half. Trace an arc going from roughly around the middle line upward towards the top right corner of the lower third. This is the jaw seen from the side. From there, draw an upward stroke towards the ear, joining the mandible. From the top of the forehead inside the grid, draw an arc going towards the back of the head for the skull. When you reach downwards to complete the circle, stop just after the start of the lower third. That's where the skull connects with the neck. Now partition the middle section in the same way as the bottom section to draw the eye. The iris will sit on top of the first horizontal line, towards the outer third of the left-hand half. Around it, draw 2 arcs to close the eye. Please note that the lower line of the eye isn't straight, which is something I've seen many beginners do. It's a curved line that goes upward because the orbital cavity is a circle and not a flat square. You can also draw a couple of strokes to give the sense that the eye is sitting on top of the cheek and that there's some roundness underneath it. Going straight down from the iris, you'll find the line that delimits the bottom of the nose and below the ending of the mouth. Again, this is pretty straightforward to start getting your bearings when it comes to approaching the head from the front and sideways. If you want to put your faces in a 3D setting with different poses and perspectives, you just have to build your usual rectangle grid and then turn it into its relative 3D shape, that is, a rectangular cuboid, and connect the grid accordingly to the back of the prism. When you have built the 3D grid, you can follow the exact same steps we took in the front process, but of course following the 3D guides and different perspectives. As I mentioned before, I think that this method has some great advantages. First, it can provide a useful guide to draw faces in awkward perspectives. Like, even if I normally draw faces without a grid, sometimes I use it when I really can't figure out where things are gonna go in certain positions. And even if afterwards I change the proportions to suit my style, it's still a good guide to keep underneath on a less visible layer. Also, you can progressively experiment with the grid and change it to adapt to your own proportions. If, for example, you usually draw eyes bigger than normal as a stylistic feature, you can adapt the grid to that standard and still use it. The biggest downside to using this process, however, is that these are very irregular, standard proportions, and while they don't reflect real-life faces, using regular proportions can even be a hindrance to character design. The appeal of design is in switching up proportions in order to create more interesting shapes. By making one section of the face much bigger than the others, we can immediately convey something about the character, make it more memorable and more appealing. To do this, you have to abandon this method at some point and start experimenting. For this video's first assignment, I created a worksheet with a front and side grid side by side. I would encourage you to draw several faces following this process step by step. For assignment number 2, something a bit more creative. Draw several small rectangle cuboids on a page. Don't worry if they're not perfect, just try and draw as many as possible in different angles and perspectives. Then try and fit faces inside these 3D grids following the same process as for the front. It's okay if most of these are gonna look weird. Right, so in the next video, I'm going to show you the practical method to draw in hands following a similar process to the one we just learned and using a grid. See you there when you're ready.